Ryan,
Tony, and Crystal.
We can't guarantee that you're gonna look great, but if you wanna stay in shape, well, you better hit the GymWits. That's right, man. Tell 'em.
welcome to the GymWits podcast. I'm Ryan George.
I'm Justin Guild, a.k.a. Chef Sonic.
And I'm Tony Marinucci, a.k.a. Tips with Tony, a registered dietitian.
And we are the GymWits. So I'm about to throw a monkey wrench into what you were about to say just now, but also just into our whole recording situation. So I'm kind of doing the opposite of Tony, where Tony went from kind of structured corporate life to entrepreneur, and I'm going from more that, like, working for myself to, corporate world. I got a new job that starts in June as assistant fitness manager, group fitness director, and personal training director. And so
we should really be saying congratulations.
Yeah, no, it's a different gig for me as a trainer. I mean, I've done management over the years, but this is a pretty significant change for my normal life, where it's like a kind of regular hours. I also get vacation time and benefits and stuff like that you don't get as a trainer. So no matter how much money or how busy you are as a trainer, or group fitness instructor, you only make money when you're working. And so often for most gigs, you really don't get the benefits that come with having kind of a steady gig. And I think there's always this trade-off of doing a normal job, but you also are tied to that place versus, the freedom of being a trainer. I think as I've gotten older, I'm more like, I just want my time, and I'd rather security and stability over the kind of chaos that comes with training. So, but unfortunately, it cuts right into our recording time. So before the show,
we'll figure it out.
Kind of figuring out, okay, how are we going to make this work to record? Which we will, but it's gonna be a little different. Although it might improve the sound quality if we'll still get the sirens because you'll be here. But
it might.
Less sirens.
Yeah.
You'll get my cats. A lot of my cats.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because while Ryan, so Tony is going to, pure entrepreneurship in her own job. Ryan's jumping into the corporate world. I am jumping into the fabulous world of unemployment.
Yeah.
So I'm quitting everything. So I'm going for the complete.
Actually, since you won't be in New York, we might actually have better sound quality. Like, it might be a situation where
maybe
we'll all be off site, but you won't have the New York City noises. And, so actually it might improve the sound quality.
We'll see. We'll
right.
see. It might. So I wanted to start with a couple of inspirational tales. And one thing that, especially if you've worked in really any job or in the corporate world, especially, you may have seen or been been a witness to something like this, where someone is highly touted, and you know that either you or someone else is the one with the real talent, while someone else is, for whatever reason, because maybe they talk the talk, maybe they look good, who knows, that this other person is being highly touted and getting the push, when really the people that are more talented are not. So I have two stories that are inspirational tales for anyone that has ever felt that they are not getting their due respect or their push when they're the ones with the real talent. So the first one is a fight that happened, in a mixed martial arts fight with Michael Page, who was a very highly touted fighter in the Bellator fighting championships, because he was very flashy. He had some really cool knockouts, and he was just sort of a brash guy. And he fought against a guy named Douglas Lima, who has been a solid professional for a long time, actually held titles, but because he's not flashy, was never highly touted. So what happens? Lima goes in there and just uses great skill and just knocks Page out. And and now everyone is like, wow, this guy Lima is for real. So after years of sort of struggling to be in the limelight, while and witnessing someone like Page get all the attention now Lima has the attention, and he's really earned it. So I thought that was a nice little inspirational story. And sometimes, yeah, it takes knocking the person who's being highly touted off of the pedestal, right, and sort of stealing their thunder. But congratulations to Lima. Now he's in a position to do really well. What do you think about? Have you witnessed stuff like that, you guys, where someone is highly touted, but really it's someone else who's got the talent?
I mean, sure, you see that all the time. I think I think I've been on both sides of that, where I've been the person who probably had the talent and squandered it, and also the person who probably did the work and not recognized. Sure, we all kind of can think of situations like that, but I think that particular fight was a good, that was fun to watch because of, you had kind of the kind of brash, cocky guy against the kind of workman, and the workman won, and it was good.
So I have another story, and this now I'm going to geek out a little bit, but I know Ryan will appreciate this. So Ryan and I were big professional wrestling fans growing up, and supposedly there was a lost match that happened recently between one guy that was the next big thing in professional wrestling at the time. At the time, it was the 1980s, and Hulk Hogan was king, and he was very famous. And there was another guy who was coming up, who Vince McMahon, the owner of the WWE, was. There was a guy who was touting, and his name was Tom McGee. Mm-hmm. And he fought some sort of middling guy who was going to put him over, which means you're going to make him look good. And Tom McGee was the next big thing. And he fought sort of a middling guy named Bret Hart. And Vince was so sure that Tom McGee was the next big champion. Mm. And sure enough, Bret Hart, the great Bret Hart, Bret the Hitman Hart, went in there and made him look good. Mm. And who goes on to be the next big thing?
Bret Hart.
Yes. Okay. Right. So, I think it's just a fun story. Bret Hart was the one with the talent. He was an amazing wrestler, and he was just a Hall of Famer. He's an all-time great, and yet it was the other guy who Vince thought was going to be the next big thing. Yeah. And through hard work and dedication, is actually Bret that becomes the champion. And I think that I heard about this on a radio show, that there was no one had seen, or there wasn't footage of this, but it just surfaced recently.
Oh, okay. Is that because where is the story coming from? This is
so
random.
That's why it was a sort of a lost match that no one had
YouTube
seen.
Or something,
I think you could find it somewhere. Yeah. So it's cool. I'd never even heard of this guy, but I thought that was an interesting story, how one person who was very highly touted, but it winds up being the other person who goes on and having the stellar career. Well, so I know that Hitman was one of your favorites growing up. So you'd get a kick out of that.
I'll look it up. I was going to talk about Game of Thrones, but I feel like we're going to just shut Tony out of the conversation talking about MMA.
Right.
Too much guy geek stuff.
I know that next Sunday's the last episode, so after this I'll be fine. Go ahead.
No.
That's enough geeking out for the
day. Super
day.
Divisive, but we'll talk Game of Thrones another time.
All right.
Have you ever been in a situation like that, Tone, where you've seen either someone else who, for whatever reason, and there's nothing wrong, maybe they're not a bad person, but for whatever reason, they're getting all the spotlight. Everyone thinks, oh, this is the next big person, or this person is getting all the credit, when really it's someone else with the talent, someone else with the hard work.
Yeah, I mean,
everyone's seen that, right?
Yeah. I'm thinking it might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm not even going to say it, but just certain people that have this crazy following on Instagram, or have their own TV shows and stuff. It's just because they have this status, it's they're believed to be true, but they don't even write their own stuff, first of all. Second of all, they might not, that doesn't make them really good at what they do. They just have a lot of followers. So I just thought of it that way.
No, it's very true. And we see that a lot today, especially with with social media, where if you're a good marketer, which is actually a skill in itself, you can't downplay that. If you can be good at marketing your social media, that's a great skill. But yes, in this world where so much is based on your looks and what you can fool people into thinking, then often for the people that are truly talented and maybe are hardworking, don't get as much of the spotlight. Mm-hmm. So I thought that those two stories were nice little inspirational tales. If you're in that situation where you're better than someone, or you're good at the very least, and you know you're hardworking, yet someone, other people are getting the talent, other people are getting the spotlight, stick with it. Your talent will eventually rise to the top. The cream will rise, eventually if you stick with it. Mm-hmm. So that's my inspirational tale for the day.
That was nice.
Cool. Okay, so well, anything else to add before we get to the studies? All right, so a couple interesting studies for today. One, it's not a whole ton to it. I'm going to link to it because there's some more as far as like directions and stuff that I'm not going to get too much into. But it's about combining leg day with running, which actually has a kind of practical application. So basically, we think a lot of us do weight training, some kinds of training for the legs, but you also incorporate cardio. And I think there's been a lot of instances in studies showing that they don't necessarily coexist all that well, because endurance training, you usually recover pretty quickly, so about within 24 hours, where resistance training can take several days, could take 2-3 days potentially to recover from. So there's always kind of a question of, how do I program in my cardio and my legs? Do I do both in the same day? How do I make it work? And so this study from James Cook University kind of took a look at all the different studies and created kind of flow charts and attempted to kind of minimize the damage done and kind of maximize kind of recovery. And so it found that if you're going to do both in the same day, your best bet is to do the endurance first, and then at least a half a day of rest between that and doing your actual strength training. And so again, I'm going to include a link so you can see a lot more of the details included in it, because again, it's a lot of stuff, but just interesting that if you do have to do both in the same day for whatever reason, then your best bet is actually kind of split it up, do your endurance early and then strength training later, which is a little opposite. We typically hear like do your strength training before the resistance. I think the difference being, if I'm doing like a chest workout, then I might, or like let's say you're doing chest and arms or something, like you kind of your standard kind of standard weight training or whatever, strength training. If it's not the legs, you can probably get away with doing that. You can do your chest, back, whatever, and then run afterwards. But in this case, since you need the strength for the legs, so generally the idea is that you want to do the resistance because you're tapping into energy resources earlier,
right, that
don't where the aerobic is kind of the last resort. So you can kind of get away with zapping all of your your short term and medium term energy sources. You can tap into that doing the strength training, and then when those reserves are near depleted, you'll have enough for the cardio because you just you don't need as much of that fat, immediate sources of energy. So but with the legs, the difference being that if you start running, you're gonna zap the legs, and so you're gonna be fatigued, and then you won't have. I'm sorry. Actually,
yeah, that's why
completely wrong.
Right? What you're saying is right, but that's why the study's confusing.
Yeah. So that's actually I'm not sure. I'm not sure why.
That's
but
why
I guess
I'm
it makes
confused.
sense. So no, here's why. I got it. I'm like all over the place. So if you do the resistance training first, you're damaging the legs. So you're going to need that recovery time. And so if you do the resistance first, you're in the midst of what you're supposed to be a long recovery.
Gotcha.
And then you're stuck with trying to then do your cardio. Mm-hmm. If you do the cardio first, because that doesn't require as much recovery time, I think you do the cardio early, then you give yourself a half day break and you kind of minimize the damage. So you're not going to be 100% when you do the resistance training workout, but you're also going to be kind of fresher than if you did it the other way around. So that was it. It was like I knew where it was going somewhere, and then I kind of like lost my like train of thought. But I think that kind of makes sense if you're doing those two. But I think if you're gonna do like any other body part and cardio, I would do it the opposite way.
So wouldn't it make sense to say, well, look, just on my leg days, I'm gonna not go crazy with the aerobic stuff? Wouldn't that make sense for one day if you want your leg day to not do that?
Okay, but you're still gonna need recovery time. So I think it's a matter of like maximizing the benefits of both. Yeah, if I'm trying to put on tons of size on my legs, or I want to put a lot of strength, I might just not do cardio. or you might skip it. But let's say you're in a program where you're doing legs a couple days a week. Well, if you're doing legs a couple days a week, you're going to require that recovery anyway. So if for whatever reason you're trying to do that type of training where you're doing two things in the same day, it's called like concurrent training, then that's the best bet. So there's no perfect way, and sure, you can just not do cardio on the same day, but just that's the that's a way to do it if you're going to do both in the same day. And then again, you can take a look, different kind of options, different ways to do it. But
and
if
eat
you're
lots
going
of
to do it the same
carbs.
day, yeah.
Lots of carbs on leg day.
All right. So the second study, this comes from Johns Hopkins University. And basically it's about just a growing number of inactive women, which is, obviously can be and is problematic. So it was a national survey of 19 million women dealing with cardiovascular disease. Is that enough for you? 19 million? Good enough study for you, Justin?
I think so.
Okay, good. All right. Just checking, since you're the mayor of study land and I need to get your approval. So anyway,
He's shaking.
You have my approval.
Okay, good. All right. So basically what they found was that half of the women studied or surveyed did not meet the minimum physical activity requirements, which would be about 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week. So 150 minutes total is like the minimum requirement. So what they found was, obviously a number of things. One, the less active you are, the less healthy you are, which then is going to increase healthcare costs. So what they also found was that the women in this study that did meet the physical activity requirements actually spent 30% less on healthcare costs. So you obviously have a whole kind of cascade of effects from the inactivity. And so it just kind of highlights the need for physicians to really make sure, especially with patients dealing with cardiovascular disease, just how important physical activity is. And I think, there may be some, disconnect. And so you are in a situation where you're suffering from something like cardiovascular disease. It's actually more important, unless it's completely kind of contraindicated, that you're getting enough physical activity, because that's one of the things that's going to, potentially help you and save you, and increase, your chance of, or decrease the mortality risk.
I think it files a little under Captain Obvious, but it's still important.
The reason why I would say
get it
it's
out
not
there.
necessarily Captain Obvious, well, it is, but it isn't. Is I think for a lot of people, they still feel like, if you're dealing with some kind of a heart issue, there's almost a fear of intense work. And I think it's, it's like anything, there's a risk reward. So for most people, it's going to be beneficial, but you are going to have a small percentage that are going to, that it's not going to have a good effect. And that's just that's exercise in general. Most people are going to benefit from it, but you're going to have people who do get injured, who do get sick, and who even, who die. And it's a very, very small percentage. So there is a small risk, but it's more, on average, it's going to be far, far more important to be physically active.
But do you think most people are saying, "Oh, I have a cardiovascular issue. I'm not going to work out," or do you think that? You think that a lot of people in that position, a lot, not all, certainly, because there are so many reasons why one might have a heart issue, right? You might be born with an issue, but as we know, a great amount of cardiovascular issues are due to poor lifestyle choices, poor diet, no exercise. So I almost feel like a lot of people that are in that situation in the first place are because they've made not the best lifestyle choices. So at that point, they're not going to be like, "Oh, I have a heart issue." That's just not part of their lifestyle to work out and eat healthy. So you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. What do you think?
A good percentage of people.
I'm not really sure what I'm not sure what the point is.
So it's sort of like a chicken or the egg.
Yeah.
So Ryan's saying that a lot of the women that have cardiovascular issues are not exercising enough. But and what I'm saying is a lot of the women, or just anyone men too, that have cardiovascular issues are in that predicament in the first place because they have made poor lifestyle choices that have led to that. Certainly not all, but a good percentage for sure.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
So it's like now, once you've now you've gotten to the point where you have heart issues, perhaps you are obese as well, and you've lived the lifestyle of not being healthy. It's you're just going to jump into a cardiovascular routine. It's not always that simple,
Yeah.
which brings many other issues. So it's like a doctor someone can walk into a doctor's office. They're very overweight and they have a cardiovascular issue or they have a heart issue, and the doctor says you need to start working out. Right. Well, that's great. A doctor can say that, but if their lifestyle is not conducive to that, good luck getting people to start working out or eating healthy all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about that, as Ryan would say, ad nauseum. Mm-hmm. Which I guess brings about a whole other issues. But yes, it is important to know that people that have cardiovascular issues, once they are diagnosed with that, are still not exercising enough. Yeah. So I think that is. But no,
I think there is this kind of stigma if you are dealing with a heart problem. There is kind of a stigma attached to intense exercise, and unless it's contraindicated, it's something that's going to be beneficial. So obviously, yes, if you've had heart surgery, you probably the next day don't want to go run a 10K, but there is on some level. That type of exercise is gonna be beneficial for most people. There's always gonna be a risk with exercise, but I think it's kind of removing that stigma, and kind of like we talked about with the food, where if people think it's a crutch, if you think food is it's eating healthy is too expensive, it's the same kind of a thing where if you're kind of predisposed to not want to exercise, then it's an easy excuse.
It's like just another excuse.
Yeah. So you kind of just want to push past that.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Very cool. So today we have kind of a little hodgepodge of stuff, but I wanted to talk for a while about form. So I've always had people ask about kind of not even necessarily proper form. We're not going to talk about like different specific exercises, but kind of when you're exercising, the different positions you're going to be in, and just some basic things to kind of be aware of. Now, before I get into kind of my specifics, do you guys have any questions on form or movement or anything that like bugs you when you're exercising? Or
so here's the one that I have always wondered, and it's about range of motion when it comes to form. So, and I mean I have a rudimentary knowledge of it, but to an extent, I just can't go down. I just can't extend my body in certain ways. Like, for instance, even with my hand, like I can't, like, I'm trying to turn my arm over. Isn't that weird, Tony? Like, I can't do this. Like, see how easy you do it? It's like really a struggle for me to just turn my palm towards the sky.
Okay.
So now I know that I can work on it, but like with something with a squat, for instance, it's very, very difficult for me to go down far.
Yeah.
Right. I can. It's just really hard for me. Mm-hmm. So how important is it that I push through that and I just try to do it, even if it means using a lot less weight or something like that? Right. Is it that important? Like, I still do the right form, but I just can't do the complete range of motion.
So you can have different schools of thought on this. Like, you're gonna have people that are kind of hardcore, like you gotta ass to grass, like you gotta just do everything you can, build as much flexibility as you can, and then you have others that will kind of say, look, it doesn't matter, your flexibility is your flexibility as long as it's not harming you. You do what you can. I'm somewhere in the middle, but leaning a little bit more towards do what your body is capable of. So I'd say there is a natural range of motion that you kind of your body's predisposed to. If you're finding everyday life activities or athletic activities are impacted by a lack of flexibility, then you should definitely, you want to try to fix the range of motion, I should say, or flexibility or that movement, whatever the movement is. So let's say with the squat, like the closest everyday thing we do to a squat is sitting in a chair. So if you find that like just sitting, getting out of your chair, like if you can't get out of, like let's say you're sitting upright and then you're not using your hands for support. If you have a hard time getting up out of your chair like that, then that may be a problem. So maybe you do need to work on flexibility and or strength or your range of motion. There are things specific to that movement that you might need to work on. But if in everyday life you just aren't noticing any problems, there's no pain, there's no discomfort, you're not, you're able to perform all the activities you want to perform day to day. I would say, do what's comfortable and do what is within your range. And, like let's say if you're doing squats, and you find that the range is limited and you want to increase it, sure. But I don't see a need to, like, again, ass to grass, or I don't see a need to push your limits of range of motion unless there are already kind of severe limitations. So I'd say go with what your body is kind of naturally able to do. Some people are just naturally more flexible than others. I'm never going to be, a dancer level flexibility. It's just never going to happen. But I would like my range of motion better for kicks. So I'm going to do specific things for that specific move. I'm not going to sit and try to touch my toes all day long, but I will be, I'm going to work on types of, movements that will increase my ability to throw higher kicks. So I think you really, to kind of tackle things based on your body. I tend to be kind of that school because I just don't, I don't know that they're, unless it's affecting you day to day, I don't know that it really means that much to really hammer home trying to, increase your range of motion or your flexibility.
Is that similar to like a push-up? Like some people can't go all the way where they put their chest to the, like, is that range of motion thing or is that strength?
Strength. That's more strength. But again, you have to it depends on the movement and the person, but generally that's strength. And even with push-ups, so it depends because there's a lot of shoulder, for a lot of people, if someone has a really, really weak upper body or even moderate, there's a lot of shoulder involvement in a push-up, and you just always want to be careful with the shoulders in general. So if somebody's having a hard time doing a full range of motion push-up, I just gradually increase. So you over time and since it's a strength thing, you can try to increase the range of motion. But you just want to do it incrementally because there is a lot of shoulder involvement. You want to make sure that that the form doesn't collapse and that they don't injure themselves. Mm-hmm. So with something like a push-up, if you're struggling to do it, I would just, like I said, have an idea of what your range is and then make it a goal to slowly increase the range, but don't increase it to the point that it's extremely painful or uncomfortable or the form breaks down.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Oh, I guess while the push-up question reminded me of something that I've struggled with for years. It's actually with push-ups or similar exercises, and that's wrists. Now, as you know, I've been playing guitar my whole life and drums, so there's a lot of stress on my wrists.
Do you think that's why you can't lift your hand up? Because your hands are always the other way.
That's a perfect point.
It's possible, but I think it might be more in my...
No. Well, you can't turn your palm up, right? Okay. So that's...
I can. It's
difficult.
It's like a big...
That's fine. Yeah.
Because if you're always...
It's not awful.
If you're always like
in the
this, you're always the opposite direction. That makes so much sense.
Yeah, it does
I'm a
make
genius.
sense. Yeah. No, Tony's right.
No,
because do it with your right hand. Wait, which hand do you strum with? You're right, and you have your range is limited more
both
on your right, but far more on your right. Look,
is it?
Yeah,
far more.
Totally.
So, so Tony had it right.
Well, so there you go. It shows that when you do a motion over and over again, like that's your body gets used to it.
That makes sense.
So I've had a lot of wrist because of that, and also for doing martial arts and lifting weights. It's a lot of stress on the wrist, and as you know, you can't really build up your wrists.
Yeah.
So, what are some ways to preserve your wrists?
That's a good question. One thing
I know people wrist curls, but that's not a wrist; that's a forearm.
Full range of motion on the wrist is important. So, doing things that really work. Your wrist does a lot of different things. You can flex, you can extend, you can invert, you can laterally flex, you can rotate. Medially, you can rotate laterally, you can supinate, you can pronate. So a lot of stuff is going on with the wrist and the hands. So if you as a guitar player where you're doing kind of one specific motion on the wrist, you want to be able to to complement that or counter that with movements that work the wrist in all other directions, so that there's not kind of a major kind of compensation pattern. But there's not a lot you can do, depending on the sport. Like if you're boxing, definitely wrapping the wrist is important. Doing grip type exercises can help because that can build the muscles on the forearm, possibly take some of the strain off the wrist. And just being aware of being aware of how you're feeling, and when you need to, taking time off. If you're a boxer and your wrist is bothering you, maybe take the day off. Maybe you want to relax a little bit, or you need to do some other things for care. You need to go to PT. So, I just say making sure that you're maximizing the full range of movements in the wrist is important.
What about what they say, keep your wrist very straight when you're doing a bench press or a push? Is there any credence to that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to minimize the strain. That's going to give you better kind of leverage, put you in a better mechanical position. So I think that's fine. But I think just in general, if you're doing any one activity a lot, you need to move around.
Yeah, it was one activity, but then I did kickboxing for a while, and punching a heavy bag, puts.
And I mean, if there's an injury, then
like
always, I'm not the guy to talk to. You go to a physical therapist.
There's no injury. It's just
or you go to a doctor, possibly. But otherwise,
I did go once. It was for my wrist and hand. They said that I have tendonitis, which of course, as we know, means nothing. It just means you have the inflammation. Right? Is one of the most annoying diagnoses. It's like, oh great, what do you do? Take Advil.
Yeah, pretty much.
Superman, turmeric. Seriously.
All right, so what we're going to talk about a little bit today is some positioning things to be aware of. So like when you are exercising, what are some things you want to think about? And so in almost any, so we'll talk a little bit standing, seated, bent over. So a couple of those things. Now, obviously, it'd be probably a little bit better to have a visual guide here. So I'll do my best to describe things. But basically, so when you're standing, so I guess I'll start a little bit further back. A couple things to think about is you think, I'm going to kind of go from the ground up. So we'll talk about your foot position, your knee position, your hip position, your trunk, shoulder blades and head. So when you're standing, a couple things to think about is that your feet should be about hip width apart, maybe a little wider, maybe a little more narrow, depending on your comfort. The knees should always be kind of slightly bent, so there's a little bit of give in the knees. What happens is if your back, there should always be like a slight arch in the back that's natural, but you want to kind of brace your stomach as if you're bracing for a punch. And shoulder blades are kind of back, like kind of the cue is kind of like if you're squeezing like a berry between your shoulder blades or something. So, and then head's back. So if you were against the wall, the points touching the wall, like if you're standing against the wall, the back of your head would touch the wall, back of your shoulders would touch the wall, your butt would touch the wall, your middle back would touch the wall. There'd be a slight arch in the lower back, enough to fit maybe your fingers. And your heels would touch the wall. So that's kind of like ideal, but I think most of us have that kind of head forward position. The shoulders are rounded. So those are some kind of things to think about. Again, feet hip width apart, knees bent. Now the reason why the knees you want the knees bent is, it's all kind of it kind of links in a chain. So if you straighten up the knees fully, that pulls down on the pelvis. And then if it pulls down on the pelvis, that means you're going to arch your back too much. And then you're not able to brace the stomach. So again, feet hip width apart, knees bent slightly, stomach's braced, shoulder blades together when you're standing. You look like you have a question.
No.
Okay.
No, I'm just
all right. So
trying to visualize all of it.
Yeah. So now when you're seated, it kind of very similar. So, you want to be, if you're seated, you still want to have the feet about hip width apart. Ideally, you can get close to a 90-degree angle at the knees, but then everything else is the same. A slight arch in the back, but stomach is braced, shoulder blades together. Now, if you're doing a movement bent over, like a bent over row, like where you're standing, but rowing. So the thing to consider with movements like that, like a bent over row is a good example. The point is working the lats. So you're trying to get your lats as close to parallel to the floor as possible. So you want to get your trunk as close to parallel to the floor as possible, which is for a lot of us not going to be fully possible flexibility wise, because as you get close to parallel, you might start to round the back. So things to consider with that is you want to sit back and lean forward as much as you comfortably can, with the back, your trunk still being relatively straight. So you're not like rounded at the top of the back. But again, shoulder blades together, and kind of stable, so that you're not, not unstable, not falling forward. You don't feel like you're falling back. So that could be a tricky one for some people. Some people can get fully parallel. Some people are at maybe 45 degrees. And for some people, you just want to avoid that exercise altogether and do something like with a cable, where you can, adjust for your, the lack of flexibility, to get into that position. So now if you're lying on your back, so in that situation, like on a bench, or even on the floor. So again, you want to make sure, so if you're on the floor, then the feet will be on the floor. So the, knees are bent, but high. If you're on a bench, then the feet will be on the floor, but your kind of butt's elevated. So either way, still want to have the feet about hip width apart. You still want to have those points of contact. So the butt's contacting with the bench, and there's that slight arch in the lower back, but your abs are tight, so you're bracing your stomach. So there's just a very slight arch. But then again, same thing. Shoulder blades are together, heads back against the floor. So you want to make sure that you're not kind of pushing your head. A common thing for people to do is kind of heads pushed forward while they're doing kind of a bench press or something where they're lying on the floor. So you still kind of have those points of contact on the floor, and feet are flat. So if it's on a bench and your feet are up, you may need to lower the bench a little bit. And if you're on the floor, just make sure the feet are bent flat and you're in a kind of comfortable position. Yep.
So now, what about if you're doing exercises off of a physio ball, where your back is where you're sort of
same
resting?
thing. So on a physio ball, that's a good question. Generally resting on your upper back and head. But again, depending on the movement, you might need to change that up a little. So, but generally like upper back and head resting against the ball with something with like a physio ball. But everything else is the same. You want to, in that case though, your trunk is not being supported. So you have to brace the stomach, engage the glutes to keep the hips up. So those are things you want to consider when you're doing like an exercise, like lying on a physio ball. And then, so a couple things like movement wise. So then you're dealing with like, rotational movements, like where you're twisting. You want to make sure, well, actually, I'll start earlier for a squat. So we'll do a squat first. So when you're doing a squat, like a couple mistakes people make is either they bend too much at the waist or they bend too much at the knees. So they almost like try to sit back with an upright spine, or they fall forward, but they don't bend the knees enough. So ideally you're doing both things at once. You shoot your hips back, which causes you to bend forward at the waist, but also to bend at the knees. And so when you're doing that, if you think like, if you look, like imagine looking at somebody doing a squat from the side, as they sit back, there's going to be a little shift forward where the shins are, and the trunk shifts forward. So ideally the angle at the shins at the trunk are close to parallel, if that makes sense. Like when you're sitting back, that both of those remain relatively the same. If it's not, then or not close to it, then there's either too much of a bend forward or not enough of a bend forward, or too much of a bend at the knees or not enough of a bend at the knees. And the other big thing with the squat is that imagine if there's a perpendicular line from your toes, your knees shouldn't cross that line. And that's kind of common knowledge, but something to be aware of, because I see tons of people doing squats where the knees are way in front of the toes. You kind of want to be aware of that. So the other thing is like a hinge type movement. So like, you guys done like kettlebell swings? Mm-hmm. So same thing with the kettlebell swing. So that hinging motion it's all in the hips. So I think a lot of times you'll see someone do a kettlebell swing where it looks like basically a squat, and you'll bend the knees slightly with the kettlebell swing, but the movement of the swing is really the hips hinge back and forward. So you shoot your hips back and then shoot the hips forward, and that movement's what creates the momentum, where you transfer the energy through the arms into the kettlebell. So the movement then, when you shoot your hips back, you shoot your waist, your trunk falls forward, the knees bend slightly, and then by driving the hips forward, you kind of engage the glutes and shoot the hips forward, you transfer the energy into the kettlebell. So that's got to be done kind of quickly, and each move has to kind of fall into the other. So when you shoot forward, the weight goes up, and as the weight comes back down, momentum has to continue into the hips going back, and then you shoot the hips forward and you're able to get the swing. If you do it like a squat, then it becomes like kind of a different exercise, So now rotation. So if you're doing a movement where you're rotating, a couple things to consider are the hip, your kind of hip positioning. So if you're rotating to your right, generally you're going to want to pivot at least your left foot. So that opens up your hips and allows your trunk to rotate properly. So what will happen a lot of times is people will rotate, but they keep their feet really planted and rigid, and then they end up a lot going on in the spine and a lot more kind of torque that's unnecessary. When you're doing a rotation or a chop, the chop should be kind of a natural movement, and so you want to pivot. If you watch a baseball player swing a bat, or a golfer swing, or throw a punch, they're pivoting on that kind of out to the rear side. That allows you to turn your hips, which allows you to generate power. And so if you don't turn your hips, just there's a lot of unnecessary movement, and it's functionally not great. And there's a lot more greater potential for injury when you're doing that. So if you're doing any kind of rotational or chopping movement, try to pivot as you do it, and make sure your hips kind of rotate with your shoulders. Hips and trunk, shoulders kind of pivot, rotate together. So a couple more movements. So if you're doing a pushing movement, like a bench press, shoulder blades together, try to keep the head back so you're not shooting your neck forward, and you're not allowing your shoulders to project forward. So especially like a bench press, if you want your chest to do the work, you want to keep the shoulder blades back, down and back, and allow the chest to do the movement. But if you release the upper back, then it's a lot of shoulder work, and then you can put a lot more undue strain on the shoulders. And on the flip side, if you're doing a pulling movement, the same thing. By stabilizing the shoulders, you allow the lats to do the work. So you want to keep the shoulder blades back and together as you pull. So if you want to get full range, what you'll see people do, like if they do like a row, is when they reach the arm, extend the arms, they'll release the shoulders as well. But if you do that, you want to make sure that you pull the shoulders back first, and then you pull the weight. If that makes sense. And then plank. So if you're doing a plank, so just like we talked about, if you're, everything's kind of the same as if you're standing. You want to have the almost a straight line from the shoulders down to the ankles, and bracing the stomach, and not too much of an arch in the back. And if you do have an arch in the back, or if you find it's too hard, then just bend the knees and drop the knees to the floor. So then instead of a straight line from the ankles to the shoulders, there's a straight line from the knees to the shoulders, and you'll kind of get the same benefit of doing that.
So I've heard that when doing certain exercises, especially back exercises, deadlift, even a row, that you always want to face forward. You never want to look at yourself if there's a mirror on the side. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah.
Like if you're doing a deadlift, for instance, you never want to turn your head.
You want your spine in a neutral position. So if you kind of look at the way where the spine is, right, and then that obviously your head connects to the cervical spine. If you turn your head, that any rotation in the spine, potentially can be bad if you have heavy weights, but also it's going to affect everything else. So you can't rotate a segment by itself, and so you compromise the structural integrity of the body by rotating or moving or shifting or doing something mid movement with a heavy weight. So you want to maintain that kind of structural integrity. So you want to keep the spine in as close to kind of a neutral position as possible. So if you're doing a deadlift or a squat, ideally if you can use your eyes to look while you maintain the right position. But if you start looking up, that's it just increases the risk of injury. Especially rotating is really a bad idea. So you definitely don't want to rotate your neck as you're doing it, and look at yourself in the mirror if you're doing if there's a mirror on your side. But yeah, even with that, you don't necessarily want to look up as you're doing the move. Once you start, try to keep as close as you can to a neutral position to again keep you stable and kind of maximize the integrity.
So I have a question about squats.
Yeah.
The machines where it's oh God, how do I explain this? It's not a free weight. Mm. So you squat down with the machine.
Oh yeah, like the Smith machine.
Yes,
yeah.
That's what they're called. I don't like those at all. Yeah. Is that good for someone just starting out if they want proper form? Because it's, what tell us about that.
So I mean, that's been always a big thing. They would always say never do a Smith machine. There's kind of a natural arc to most movements, and since the Smith machine is kind of in one line or one range,
I feel like it's so difficult.
It's generally really hard to do. I would say definitely not for a beginner. It's just you're not going to learn the proper movement. So you're better off doing body weight squats if you're a beginner than doing Smith machine squats. Mm-hmm. And you're better, doing very light squats, with a bar than you are doing it with the Smith machine. I don't know, I don't know that it's the worst thing in the world if you're experienced and you don't have a spotter and you want to do weight. I think, I would say it's probably less safe than doing normal squats, but I also think that we kind of would talk about the Smith machine as if it's the worst thing in the world, and I don't know that it's that bad either. I don't read as much as we'd like to talk about how horrible it is. I haven't read enough to say that yes, it's definitely that bad. I just don't think it's as good as doing free weight because it's not a natural movement. So I would say definitely beginner, no. And most advanced or seasoned exercisers, I don't see a reason why. You're better off doing a lighter weight with a free weight bench or a free weight squat rack than you are doing really really heavy with the Smith machine. Mm-hmm. But if that's all you have access to, it's probably not the worst thing in the world. But I definitely think that there are more risks, and it's definitely riskier than doing it normally. But I don't think you're going to kill yourself if you're using a Smith machine either.
Gotcha. Okay.
Cool. Anything else?
Yes.
Yeah.
With jumping.
Yeah.
What is the proper way to? I know it sounds simple, but jumping actually can cause injury, and I'm sure a lot of people have injured themselves trying to jump. And there's different types of jumps. There's box jumps. There's jumps where you you sort of explode up there, where you jump into a low we almost fall into a squat. There's plyometric jumps.
Yeah.
So do you talk a little bit about sort of the proper way to jump,
I'll just
and
say,
almost more importantly, the proper way to land?
I'll say basic jump. Yeah, well, yeah. So if you're for the basic regular jump, I think a couple of things to think about. It's a very much like a squat, right? You're relying on momentum as much as you can to kind of energy transfer to get up as high as you can, and then depending on how high you jump, there's a significant amount of weight now falling down to the floor. So as you said, like if you don't land properly, it could be jarring and it could potentially lead to an injury. So for the jumping part, I think an important thing is to not slack off on the preparation for it. So I think a lot of people, I'll see people do jumps and they just kind of like half-ass doing the jump. So make sure you're sitting back just like with the squat or like a hinge. So it's kind of mixing the hinge with the squat where you sit back, lean forward, your arms should swing back, kind of behind you. And then it's a sequential movement. So you start by swinging your arms up, right? Then as you're doing that, you begin to drive through your heels up towards the ceiling. And so it's kind of a sequential movement there where the arms kind of help the trunk move, which helps the hips drive forward, the legs, quads extend, and you're up. So doing that, you're kind of able to, it's like a squat, basically, kind of very similar to a squat. It's just an explosive squat, and you're really trying to generate as much power as you can upwards. Now, the key there then is on the landing. The landing's got to be as soft as possible. So ideally, you want to think about it as making as little noise as possible. So like we could both, I could jump right now. I'm 165 pounds, and I could do a jump where I just make a clunk, and then I can also do a jump where I make a very, very soft sound. And so it's all in how you land. If you land soft, and that means kind of like you fall into the landing. So you kind of, as you're landing, you're falling into another squat. So kind of the ideal landing puts you back in position to jump again because you're kind of hitting the ground, but your weight's still dropping down as you fall back into that squat. So you want to think about it as like you jump, and as you land, you want to land back into position to jump again. Rather than jumping and then landing with straight legs and kind of clunking on the ground and then resetting, you want to make it efficient. So as you land, you're landing in position to jump again. Then you jump again. And as you land back in position to jump again. Again, it's one of the things a little harder. A lot of this is a little bit harder to describe than to show, but just think if you're jumping, try to make it as quiet of a landing as possible, and that generally is
Now, what if you're landing on something
like what,
like a box jump?
Same. I mean, it doesn't change the principle. I think the big thing with a box jump is not doing it too high. Even I had somebody doing a jump the other day at 6 inches. I thought it was nothing for them, and they almost tripped and fell into a bicycle. So you have to be, you still have to be, when you're doing jumps, it's got to be something that you're comfortable with. Otherwise, start very low. Make sure there's nothing on the floor in front of you or behind you, because I can't tell you how many times I've had people do jumps where they just left weights sitting behind them and they're ready to jump and land into weights. So you just want to make sure that you're still always focused on the landing, and that it's a height that's comfortable for you, and that there are not objects around you that you can land or fall onto.
I find there's a big confidence thing. Like, if you don't think you can get the jump, don't jump it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you'll probably fall. But if you really, I don't know, this is like separate, but like if you really feel like you can get the jump, you're going to get the jump. Because I really, it comes from there. Because when you hesitate, that's when the foot doesn't go up. That's when you you falter. But like, start baby small.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what about being able to properly do a plyometric jump? So, or anything plyometric, how to make sure that you're actually using what's the energy?
It's like reactive or stretch shortening cycle, a number of things. But you almost want to refer to our plyometric episode.
Yeah.
I would say that's not something we can really cover today because it's very specific, it's very technical, and I would say that should be under the supervision of a professional.
Oh, really?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, you could try it. You could, look up stuff, buy books, listen to our podcast episode on it. But it is highly specific, and depending on the kinds of plyometrics you're doing, because I think a lot of people talk. Again, plyometrics is a very specific thing, and I think people just whole cloth use like anything that's jumping as plyometric, and that's not really what plyometric training is. So. I would just say, you definitely, if you're going to do specific real plyometrics, you want to do that with somebody who knows what they're doing and knows how to teach it, and not just jump into it. Especially things like depth jumps, like where you really need to be brought along to do stuff like that. You can't just kind of jump into it like it's nothing.
Hey, good to know.
All right. Well, I guess that's it. If you guys have questions on form or movement or any of that stuff, please, leave us a message at thegymwits@gmail.com, or you can do it Ask the Trainer on the website, which is thegymwits.com. But I guess that's it. Not much else to add today. I'm Ryan George.
I'm Justin Guild, a.k.a. Chef Sonic, reminding you that truth doesn't sell.
And I'm Tony Marinucci, aka Tips with Tony, a registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time.
And we are the GymWits.